Hello, you guys, and welcome to another edition of the Portrait Profits Show. My name is Jim Landers, and my mission is simple. I help portrait photographers like you make a great income doing what they love. Each week, you get tips and systems on the business side of photography, designed to help you gain a mastery over marketing and sales, reducing the struggles that most photographers face so you can finally get what you deserve. You're in the right place. Welcome to the Portrait Profits Show. This show, Portrait Profits, is brought to you by Digital Pro Lab at, and I'll bring that up, digitalprolab.com. And we have Amanda with us today.
Hello, everybody. All right. So thank you all so much for joining us again for another weekly episode of Portrait Profits. We're really excited to bring Alicia Calzada to you today, who's going to be speaking on understanding contracts. So she's got a lot of valuable information there. So don't forget to ask your questions in the comments, because she will be answering those questions as they come up and be happy to answer those for you. Again, it is sponsored by Digital Pro Lab along with Landers Photo School. We're happy to both sponsor it and bring it to you free every single week at Digital Pro Lab. If you're not familiar with us already, we are the largest professional photo lab here in San Antonio, Texas, located at 10103 San Pedro. We are a full service professional photo lab. So that means we don't only print, we also develop film, we do some framing, and we basically help our fellow photographers and everybody here in San Antonio and throughout print pictures and make sure that you get something that's going to last the test of time. So enjoy this episode of Portrait Profits. Do come in to the lab or visit us online at digitalprolab.com, and also pay attention to the entire class today, all the way through to the end, where we're going to be sharing a promo code for 25% off of press cards. Not only do we print on standard photo papers, giclée options, we also offer press cards, so folded cards, flat cards, custom cut cards, all of those different things that you can use to help promote your business or to offer press cards to your customers. We offer those as well. So stay tuned till the end of the episode so that you can actually take advantage of that 25% off promo code. And we'll see you later. Thanks so much for watching, guys.
Thank you, Amanda. Amanda, Digital Pro Lab rocks. Digital Pro Lab rocks. We're lucky to have them right here in San Antonio with us. So thank you, Amanda. And did you want me to share that code at the end or just anytime?
Right at the end.
All right. So that means you have to stay and watch the whole thing, but you're going to love it. It's going to fly right by. So thank you guys for being here. All right. So I'm going to bring in our speaker here in just a moment. She is, her name is Alicia Calzada, and she is both a photographer and an attorney, more on the attorney side, but definitely loves photographers and has been doing things to help out photographers for a very long time. The first time I came across her was at a group, a similar photo club, but definitely dealt on the business side where she was speaking. Now, I don't know if she knew that I was there, and we talked only briefly. But that was the first time I'd crossed paths with her, and I thought she was just amazing. And so I am proud to bring on today Alicia Calzada.
Hi, everyone. Thanks, Jim. It's great to be here. I'm happy to talk to you all, and I hope that you can learn something and maybe hopefully spur some questions too. One of the things I like to encourage people to do is think not just about what I'm saying, but about what I'm not saying that it makes you think about. So I'm very thrilled to be here. Thank you.
Yay. Well, tell us a little bit about what you specialize in. What do you spend most of your time with?
Yeah, so I was a photojournalist for about 20 years. During that time, I was president of the National Press Photographers Association, and I did a lot of work in the advocacy area where I was writing legislators and other large organizations that deal with photographers, and just trying to work to make the photographers better. And doing all that work, of course, I worked with attorneys and came across a lot of legal situations and just decided that I needed to know more and to do that part of what I enjoyed. Of course, I loved my job as a photojournalist, but just kind of all the cards fell into place. So I went to St. Mary's School of Law here in San Antonio, and lo and behold, so I've been an attorney now for the past 10 years. I work in the First Amendment space a lot and in the copyright space a lot. And then for individual clients, I often do a lot of contract work, whether it's helping them create a new contract for their business or helping them review a client contract. I work a lot with photojournalists. I've tailored my presentation to be more geared towards consumer-oriented photographers, but it originated from a talk I give fairly regularly to journalists. So Jim, would you like me to go ahead and get started? I think he's off camera, so
yeah. So absolutely. So Alicia, you've brought to us great information on understanding contracts, something that we as photographers really need to know. I mean, did we care about this as much 30 years ago as we do today?
I certainly didn't. I mean, when I was being educated as a photographer, I didn't even know, that I would eventually be in business. And that's one of the things that sent me down this path was, I had been working as a staff photographer for many years. And then I found myself in a situation where I was an independent photographer and dealing with contracts with clients, copyright issues, didn't have that huge support network of a giant company behind me. And so, as is the case now with a lot of photographers, I really had to make sure I understood all this stuff on my own. And believe you me, I made a lot of mistakes at the beginning. And so one of the things I want everyone to know is that if you make mistakes, that's okay. They're actually just opportunities to learn and go forward.
I definitely want to get to the presentation, but I want to encourage those who are watching us. Please, in the comments, give us your questions, any comments you want to give. Just it could be statements, but any questions you have, we could actually get those answered live, assuming they're relevant to the topic, of course. But yeah, encourage you to like or love what we're saying. I see 2 likes already. I want to see a few more. Give us a couple of likes. That's encouraging. We get to see that. We're live streaming from something called StreamYard, but it connects us to Facebook. So every comment that you put on there, every like, every love, we see it. So give us that encouragement. Ooh, I see 2 more, 3 more. You guys rock. I love you. All right. So again, please put your comments on there, and they will show up on our screen. All right. So Alicia, share with us your presentation, what you have to share for the photographers of San Antonio.
Sure. So I think we already got a nice introduction, and this is my website and my phone number if you need anything to follow up. So let's talk for a minute about contracts and what emotions you get when you think about contracts, because I think that there is actually an emotional barrier for a lot of people when it comes to contracts, because we get big, scary contracts when we rent a car, when we buy a house, when we buy a car, all these things. And, so we think about them as this large, intimidating thing, but it's really not quite, it doesn't have to be like that. And in fact, what I like to tell people is that, well, first of all, if you get a contract with your photo business, that means you're getting money. So that's a good thing. It also really typically means that you are dealing with good customers. It makes you look like a professional, which if you're in business, you are, right? But it makes you more professional with your clients. They're more confident in you when they get a contract for you. The reason is they know what they're getting because it's right there in writing. When you have a less formal kind of arrangement, they don't always realize, or there might be questions, or it's just not all spelled out. So of course, good clients equals more contracts. So it's kind of a nice little happy circle. But the main thing I want to focus on is that good contracts means good relationships. And I'll explain what I mean. Let's say, I'll give you an example. I shot a project for a corporate client, sometime in the 2000s. And 10 years later, they came to me and they said, well, we want to do a book talking about our history. And of course, the pictures that you took are a huge part of what we want to talk about in our book. And so, what do we do? Well, I pulled out that contract. It was literally like years and years and years old, but it had it right on there. I said, so I was able to say to the client, okay, well, here's the arrangement that we had. So this is what you're doing that's included in that, and this is what you're doing that's not included in that. And so that was that. I was able to get, improve that relationship. It was all right there in black and white. And of course, I got paid additional money for the work I had done, an additional license fee that I was giving them. I think I used that money that year to buy my husband a drone. So he's also a photographer. Billy Calzada, I don't know if those of you know him. He's a shooter for the Express News and phenomenal photographer and a great drone photographer. So my point is that good contracts equals more business. And you really have to think of it that way. So the things I'm going to talk about include how a contract is formed, when a contract is formed and why that matters, what happens when a contract is broken. That matters for both you and for your clients or your customers, and some important terms to have in your contract. So if we're going to talk about contracts, let's just get back to the basics, right? A contract is an exchange of promises. So it could be as simple as I promise to take pictures of X and you promise to pay me Y. Or I promise to pay you X and you promise to give me a photo, house, a fish, anything. You actually engage in contractual agreements all the time. You just don't really think of it that way. And by the way, negotiation, people get scared about negotiation. You negotiate every day too. It's like, I want to go to the movies, and you ask your spouse, like, where do you want to go to the movies? Well, I want to go to this movie. Well, I want to go to this movie. Well, if we go to the restaurant you like, we'll go to the movie I like. That's a negotiation, So think about how you negotiate every day in your life. Think about how you engage in smaller contracts every day of your life. Whether it's, you're at the grocery store, they make you an offer. I'll sell you this gallon of milk for $5. You accept the offer by bringing the gallon of milk to the cash register and giving them $5. You just had an exchange of promises. An offer has that, or a contract rather, has that dynamic. It has an offer, it has an acceptance, and it has something called consideration. Consideration is just a fancy word for something of value. And something of value doesn't have to be money, and it doesn't even have to be stuff. It can even be just like the privilege of being somewhere. But there does have to be consideration really for a contract to be valid. You don't hear a lot about that because, like I said, it's pretty easy to get to consideration. But it's usually money. With photography, it's the thing of value you're giving is a license, or maybe prints, or maybe just the documentation of something, right? Even if somebody doesn't buy any pictures and all you've done is document it, well, that's still valuable because now those pictures exist. So a basic contract, like I said, it has this offer, will you do X in exchange for Y? It has the acceptance, right? It's no good if the other side doesn't accept. And then there's the consideration, with corporate photographers, it's licensing rights as opposed to prints usually. And then they may decide what to do, or they may do the printing. But, with consumer, if your customers and clients are consumers, then you're probably giving them a physical product. So something to think about there. a contract does not have to be in writing. Like I said, it can be oral. So over the phone, somebody might call you and say, hey, can you shoot this on Monday? And you can say, sure, I'll shoot it for this amount of money. If the other side accepts, you have a deal. You have a contract at that point. You still may follow up with a more formalized contract, but the substantive parts of those contracts are locked in. And remember, a contract is enforceable. So, a more likely scenario for people who deal with or negotiate in a contract situation, because some photographers are in a situation where they have a price list and everything's clear, but a lot of times there's just such a broad range of what you do as a photographer that what your client wants or what your customer wants doesn't quite fit into a box. In those cases, it's often, will you shoot X for $100? You reject the offer, okay? So you're not accepting that contract. And then you make what's called a counter offer. And you say, no, I won't shoot it for $100, but I will shoot it for $1,000. So of course they say, sure, no problem, right? Usually there might be a little more. So there might be rejection, counteroffer, et cetera. But the counteroffer matters because it cuts off the offer and starts a new negotiation or a new contract round. And whenever the offer is accepted or the counteroffer is accepted, that's when the contract is formed. So this is just an example. I crossed out her name because I know she's local, but I had a text message once with somebody who was working as an assistant at the time, and it was very informal. So this is what I'm talking about, right? We created a contract at this point. So, maybe she gave up another opportunity to do that. So then if I back out on her, well, I had already made a deal with her. So I might owe her money if I backed out on her when I made this offer for her to shoot. Now you'll notice there's some things missing here, like how much she's going to get paid. If you have a contract that's very, very vague, as it was oral or it was communicated in a very informal way, and you don't have a formal contract, you may wonder, like, well, how do we sort out those terms? Well, a judge who's looking at a contract that doesn't have important terms in it will look to things like the history of the relationship. So in this case, I had a relationship with this person already, a business relationship. And so you would simply look to what we had done before and the agreements we had before, which were always a consistent amount of pay. So what I would owe that person if it didn't work out was, that same amount of pay. I had this happen to me once where I had asked a newspaper, I shot some really cool pictures of a hurricane, and I called I think it was the Houston Chronicle, and I said, hey, I got some great pictures. No, we got pictures on the wire. I said, that's fine. And I sent him a really low res copy of the photo. I said, I just wanted you to see what I shot, anyway. Well, the next day I found it in the newspaper. So they published. Well, it was very easy to just sort out that, what I charged them on a regular basis was a fair amount for that particular quasi deal. So Jim, I don't know if there's any questions at this point because I'm kind of getting into
Yes, we have. Can you see that on your screen?
No, I have to.
Dianera Flores, that's based on your story. How long are you supposed to keep your images?
If in terms of whether you have an obligation to keep your images, that's something you would want to put in a formal contract. Like, and in fact, I would do that when I had like wedding clients or portrait clients. Something that says, I'm not obligated to keep copies of these images for any certain amount of time. So there's no standard amount of time that you're obligated to keep copies of images. It would all be about the agreement you had with the customer or client. And that really is a good term to put in your contract so that they don't come to you 10 years later and say, hey, I want to use these pictures. And I just assume that you have made the investment to keep every photo you've ever taken, right? that's a huge investment in storage space, whether it's physical storage space for, negatives, which hardly anyone uses anymore, but nonetheless, even if it's digital, it's still digital storage space is expensive. Keeping up with technology is expensive. Transferring your files from one format to another, expensive. All that stuff costs money. So you don't want to be on the hook for a customer who just assumes that you're in business to hang on to their stuff until they're ready for it. In the case of the corporate client I was talking about earlier, I did still have those files, but they also have files. So, it was really easy. That wasn't a problem. But, one thing to think about if you're working with, when you're considering whether to make that investment in long-term storage, is you may have somebody who comes to you many, many years later, and it's an opportunity for you to make money. So you really have to balance that cost, but you do want to be clear with them up front that, as a photographer, and I'm going to talk about copyright next, you own the copyright forever unless you give it away, until decades after you die. I believe it's 70 years after the death of the author. So not only do you own the copyright, but your heirs own the copyright when you die. That's a long time to hang on to something, but it is a potential revenue stream for that entire period of time, should somebody decide that they want to make an investment in those pictures.
Yeah, that's true. We have another question from Rick Castillo, and he says, do we need a contract when we're doing street photography?
I'm sorry, when you're doing what?
Street photography, just hanging out downtown and photographing whatever catches your attention.
Yeah, so that's a great question. There's sort of two factors there. There's, first of all, the right to take pictures in public, which if you're somewhere you have a right to be, you generally have a First Amendment right to take pictures. And you don't need a contract with people who might end up in your photograph. However, if you're going to use those pictures for commercial purpose, then which means, advertising, marketing, if you're going to license them to a client for whatever that corporate need is, it's a good idea to get a release from those people, offer them a copy of a print in exchange for signing a release or something like that. But just, if you're just taking pictures on the street and someone happens to be in your photo, generally speaking, you don't need to have a contract with them.
What about, so that would be on the model release side. If you wanted to use that, you could have that. What about property release? When you photograph those buildings, are those buildings owned by the building owner or by the architect, or how does that part work?
That is a great question. A lot of people talk about property releases and get property releases. I have never, ever read a case where somebody was held liable because they didn't get a property release. That may come into play when there's trademark issues. There are some countries that honor like the copyrighted building or something like that. Or, if there's there are some circumstances where you wouldn't want to have a sculpture in a photograph without permission. But that goes more to the use of the picture than actually taking the picture. So, some clients may want a property release. I'm not going to lose sleep if you tell me you're taking pictures and not getting property release. Of all the things I lose sleep over with photographers, that is definitely
it's not it.
Pretty far on the bottom of the list.
So generally speaking, don't need to worry about the property so much unless it's obvious. Right. But with people, what's the differentiation between needing a model release and not worrying about it?
It's about how you plan to use it.
It's all in use. Okay.
Mm-hmm. And so let me be clear about what editorial use is. It's generally nonfiction is a good way to think about it. If you are using the pictures in a newspaper, a magazine, even a nonfiction book, even if it is on the cover of a book, but it's generally a book about, say, history or something like that. If art is generally considered in that same area, And the reasons behind this are related to First Amendment speech. It is important in our society to be able to speak openly about the world. And so if that's what you're doing, whether you're communicating or exercising your First Amendment rights through art by creating artwork, or whether you're exercising your First Amendment right because you're doing something akin to journalism and reporting and communicating about the world around you, these are all First Amendment speech. And that's why you don't have to have a model release for that kind of speech and that kind of use of your photography. But when you start getting into marketing, commercial use, where you're proposing a sale or trying to get someone to use a service or a product, people have a right to, it's called a right of publicity, or so people have a right to not be associated with products unless, without their permission and those kinds of things. And the laws on those are different in every state, but you can generally count on the fact that if you're going to use something for a more commercial side, commercial purpose, then you would want to get a release. And you want to have that, if you have a contract with a corporate client, you're going to want to have that addressed in the contract, who's responsible for getting those releases. If the company uses a picture of yours and it doesn't have a release, who's liable and who's responsible for that failure?
Rick has a follow-up question.
Okay.
As a photographer, what's our responsibility when we do get a model release to make sure that the person who they say they are? So do we need to see their ID? Do we need to photograph their ID? Or do we just accept their word for it?
That's a great question. I think it would come into play. You have to think about when it's going to become an issue, right? And so if they give you a fake name, but they signed your release, and then later they came back and said, ha ha ha, I didn't have permission. I think a court's going to look at that like, well, you kind of were fraudulent with the photographer, and it wouldn't work well in their favor. So, I mean, it doesn't hurt to look at someone's ID, but think about how you can prove that the person who you photographed is also the person who signed the release, whether that's, hold up the release and take a picture of the person and the release at the same time, or something like that. If you feel sketchy, and I would also trust your instincts. People are pretty good with instinct and sketchy to you. Let's move on to the next person. The kind of hassles that come with these things are really often not worth it. Different situation, obviously, if you're working as a journalist, then you have to do what you need to do your job. But if you're just out there kind of creating art and playing around, and you don't need to secure that kind of agreement, and you feel like you're in a sketchy situation, follow your instinct, trust your judgment.
Yeah. Okay. Good. Let's see.
I'm gonna.
Dianaris says pictures for websites. Now, I'm assuming that she's talking on the same topic, and if your images are going on your, so Dianaris, you may have to broaden that question just a little bit. Are we talking about a website that's just for fun, or something you're making money with? Because I think that makes a difference there. But pictures for websites, I don't know if that question's enough for you to answer. But I do have one.
I mean, if you're taking pictures and you're licensing them to companies to use on their websites, that's certainly a commercial use, and you would want releases for that. If you are a commercial photographer that shoots things like weddings and portraits, and you want to obviously showcase your work on your own website, it's also a good idea to include in your contract with your customers something that addresses whether or not they're comfortable with you doing that, for two reasons. Reason number one is what I talked about at the beginning, good client relationships, right? You don't want to be in a situation where your customer says, "Oh my God, my kids are splashed all over your website. How could you do that to me?" And those kids are gonna, they're gonna need portraits, senior portraits. They're gonna get married. You don't want to blow that client just because you didn't have a contract. And so what you can do if that happens, you can say, well, oh, it's addressed in my contract. So, I was under the impression it was okay with you, but absolutely, if you're uncomfortable with it, you want to preserve that customer relationship. But it's helpful to be in the right, even if you have to change your path, just because it makes you look better to your clients.
Okay, makes sense. Stephen is asking about paparazzi being able to sell their photographs without a model release.
Well, you have to think about where they sell them, right? They sell them to, like the Daily News and other publications that are generally talking about, what's going on in the world, even though it's what's going on in the celebrity world. It's still First Amendment speech. You don't see paparazzi photographing Michael Jordan and then selling those photos to Nike to advertise Nike sneakers, or any other celebrity for that matter. They're just selling them to, whether it's in the UK or here, they're just selling them to publications that are talking about what celebrities are up to today, and those kind of things. It's a great question.
Yeah.
So let's talk for a sec about copyright, because you have to address copyright in your contract, or it's wise to address copyright in your contract. The default is that you own the copyright to the pictures you take. Copyright is created the moment you create the image. Okay, you don't. There is no formality. There used to be formalities related to securing copyright in this country, and we joined some international treaties that required us to be different and be better. And so the minute you push the shutter, whether it's your iPhone or your fancy Hasselblad or whatever it is, you take a picture, you own the copyright to that picture. So nothing else is required. There's no formalities, as they call them, but there are other things that are helpful, such as registering your copyright, which is a little bit more than I'm going to get into here. But just as a baseline, know that you get the copyright and it's yours the minute you create the image. Now, there are some circumstances where a company might own your copyright. One is called a work for hire situation, and that's just a fancy way of saying you're an employee of the company. So if you're getting, a W-4 and benefits and a salary from a company, you're an employee. And if you're taking pictures in the scope of your employment, then as an employee, your employer actually owns the copyright. The company is actually considered the author. If you own your photo business, if you've taken your photo business and converted it to an LLC, that's something you need to think about. If you're paying yourself a salary from your LLC, your LLC might actually own the copyright to your work. You can have a contractual agreement with yourself that changes that if you want to, and that gets into kind of the weeds, but it's something to think about whether you want to leave that copyright with the LLC or leave it with the photographer. That's also very important when it comes to registering your copyright. So if you do register your copyright and you have an LLC, it's because you're doing a lot of stuff right. Make sure that you are registering your copyright in the proper name of the copyright owner. And I'm sorry, I kind of went off on this tangent, but it's an important issue to flag. Another way that a company might own your copyright is if you sign something called a work for hire agreement. It's essentially puts you in the same legal position as if you were an employee. The company owns the agreement. A copyright can also be transferred to a corporation. A copyright transfer like that has to be in writing and signed. a work for hire agreement has to be in writing and signed. So if you see kind of a theme here, you know, basically for a company to own your image, there has to be something in writing and signed, unless you're an employee. So what I'm saying here is, for a company to use your image, they either need the copyright or they need a license. A license can be via a written agreement, like we've been talking about. It can be an oral agreement, like we've been talking about. It can also be an implied agreement, and we'll talk about that in a second. The same thing is true if your customer or your client is an individual. You can transfer the copyright to them, but it has to be signed and in writing. Or you can also give them a license. That license can be a written agreement, that's much preferable, an oral agreement, or an implied agreement. I'm suspecting that most of you are dealing with a license situation, because most of your average photo clients from the community aren't coming to you asking for copyright to the pictures. So like I said, written agreement, oral agreement, implied agreement. A written agreement obviously is your written contract. Sometimes there are also online terms that might constitute that written agreement. Something to think about if you're doing, if you're having people sign up for things via your website, is whether you should be including these terms somewhere along there so that they're aware of what the arrangement is and what you're giving them for their price. An oral agreement can come into play from things you say, but the thing you have to remember is two people often remember things differently. So it's really important to think about whether, if it's beyond just a very basic transaction, you know, you really want to defer to that written agreement. It's much more helpful. There can also be an implied agreement or an implied license. When I got married, we had a friend photograph our wedding, and he just gave me a bag of film, right? So I processed the pictures, and then I took them to get printed. Did I have a written agreement that said I could print these photos? No, but I did have an implied license to get prints of those photos. I think I got them printed at Digital Protect, by the way, because I love those guys. But you know, do you specify when you give clients files what they can do with these files? If you don't, it might be interpreted to be very broad permission. So if you send digital files, you really want to include in whatever it is you communicate to transfer those files, what the limits are on that use. You know, especially what can be done on social media. Because if they put them on social media, suddenly there's a whole new set of agreements and terms that are applying to those images. And if you give them permission to put them on social media, by default, you're sort of endorsing that permission, that new level of permission of what can be done with your images. And if you don't give them permission and they put it on there, well then, you know, those social media terms can't be enforced against you. So think about who you have obligations to and who has rights in a contract. It's really important to think about who the contract is with. Is it with your client? Yes. Who's your client, right? Is your client somebody who's paid for the photography but is not in the pictures? Or is your client the person in the pictures? There may be third-party beneficiaries to a contract where you would have obligations to them. This comes into play more often in product liability cases, but you know, it could certainly come into play in a photo situation. Your contract isn't with your client's family and friends. It's not with people who didn't sign the contract. It's not with other vendors or businesses that your client uses. Really easy to think about this in terms of a wedding, right? The people who come to the wedding, who are guests at the wedding, are not parties to your contract with the bride and the groom, presumably, right? You want to have the bride and the groom both sign that agreement. If somebody else is paying for the photography, you still want to think about who you want to be able to enforce the agreement against. If you have to have 6 people sign the contract to get everything you need and all the commitments that you need, have 6 people sign the contract. Not that bad, not that hard, especially in these days. You can put clauses in a contract that allow one person at a time to sign it. I know there are really great programs that allow people to sign things digitally. Adobe has a great system for that kind of stuff. So if you need to have other people have obligations under your contract, make sure they're a party to the contract, because you can't enforce a contract against somebody that's not a party. I think I went over some of this already. Can't make the mother of the bride pay if the contract is with the bride, right? And if the mother of the bride is the person who's going to pay, then she needs to sign the contract, or the father, or cousin, anyone. Wedding guests don't get a license. If you've given a license to the bride to do something with the pictures, that doesn't convey to the guests unless you have done so in the contract. So somebody may think, well, I was there and, this was for the bride, so I can do whatever I want with these pictures that she sent me for Christmas. No. You could, however, still be held liable for negligence against someone who's not a party to your client, because you have other obligations under theories of negligence and other things. So I put on here, and I hope you'll think about this, the most important contract you have is probably with your insurance company. Because if you're out there in business interacting with the public, sometimes things go wrong, and you want to make sure that that's not the thing that keeps you up at night. The what ifs, I'm probably a person that overinsures, because I deal with all of my what ifs by thinking, okay, I got that covered. And when do you want to get that contract signed? Now. I mean, there's no time like the present. So when the person reaches out to you and you decided that you've come to a general agreement, that is when you want to do it. You do not want to wait. You do not want to do a little bit of work first and then have an argument over what the terms are after you've already done the work. And I recommend that you tell the client, as soon as you sign this agreement, I can put this on the calendar. Because if you put it on the calendar, and then they're able to put off again and again and again, signing that agreement, then suddenly you realize you're running out the door to shoot something and you still don't have that contract. So that's timing-wise a really good way to think about it. Were there any questions before we move on to kind of the next topic, Jim?
Let's see. I think I do.
And also, do we have until 1, or I thought it was 1:30? I just want to make sure I'm not.
Yeah, we can go as long as you want to share with us. So 1 o'clock would be cool, but 1:30 would be fine too.
Okay.
Let's see. Let me look at the comments. Yes, Rick is asking the what kind of contract do we need with the insurance company?
Well, they'll have a contract ready for you, but you want one that protects, has general liability against your company. You probably want also an errors and omissions.
That's what he just said. Okay.
Yeah. So, and they're all different. It's really important to talk to the agent and make sure that they understand what you're doing, so that they can talk to you about what kind of coverage you might need. So I liken it to, your house insurance. If you tell your insurance company that, you live in a hurricane-prone area, well, you want to make sure you have insurance that's going to cover you in case of a hurricane. So likewise, if you're publishing and you're likely to get sued for libel, you want to make sure that your insurance contract covers you for those kinds of things. But if you're going places and bringing a lot of equipment, and the risk is that somebody might trip over your gear. You want to make sure that that's covered as well.
So when you mentioned earlier that you need the most important contract you have is the one with your insurance company, just talking about an insurance policy. So it doesn't mean that you're creating the contract, but the policy is the contract that we're talking about. Okay. So errors and omissions. Now, are you familiar with the PPA's insurance and their errors and omissions and other things that they have?
So, I mean, I haven't looked at it in a very long time, but I have worked with PPA on a lot of stuff, and they're fantastic. And I would certainly say that I'm sure they've done their homework and gotten good. And, if you need to call PPA and ask them, what they think about your situation, they're usually pretty responsive, I believe. They also have, I believe, a service where if you have, at least they used to, where you have a dispute with a client, they'll help you work it out, which has got to be so valuable. Jim, I don't know if you have a relationship with PPA.
A little, not.
Yeah.
I mean, I've taught classes for PPA, but that's not where I'm so active in other things that I don't spend a whole lot of time with PPA. But I definitely recommend that people do. Because they do have some good insurance. The errors and omissions, they have some new stuff about equipment. Even if you just drop it, they can help you out with that. Of course, there's go to PPA if you're curious about it. There is good stuff there.
Yeah, and I work with the National Press Photographers Association a lot. They have insurance that's for gear. If you're a member of NPPA, I encourage you to look at theirs as well. It's geared more towards, and they do have liability as well as gear insurance. I don't use it because I don't shoot anymore, so it's hard for me to talk about. But all the professional photo organizations have insurance policies. So ASMP, NPPA, PPA.
Good. All of them are good organizations.
Great place to start. Yeah.
Dianera Flores was asking about on images that are going to the client. Do you include your logo, your copyright information, or if they are using the images on their website, do we need the copyright information noted?
Are you talking about a watermark? Because some people do put watermarks on their stuff. I would think that a client who's paid you a lot of money for something may want a copy without a watermark. That's sort of between you and the client in terms of what fits their need. But I would encourage everyone to use the IPTC sidecar files, and you can use a program like Photo Mechanic or is it Adobe Bridge? Or even just Photoshop, where you go into the file info and you put in who the copyright holder is, just some basic information about what the picture is. Journalists are very familiar with doing this because they attach caption information to every single picture that they shoot and turn in. But it's useful no matter what you're doing with your photograph, because the IPTC information lives with the photograph. And so you send a JPEG to somebody, and even if you don't have like a watermark, there is information in the file info that talks about who owns the picture or who owns the copyright to the picture, even what's going on in the picture, if you want to put that in there. And then as that photo develops legs and a life of its own, that travels with it, assuming nobody strips it out, which can be done, unfortunately, in here. So I would
she followed that up, include that in the metadata. Yes. Yeah. That's right. And it's one of those things. It is easy to do, but if you're unfamiliar with it, it doesn't matter how easy it is. You don't know how to do it. But just like Alicia said, you just go to that EXIF information and add that in there, and you can set up your camera to add parts of it yourself. We're in the camera itself. You can set it up to have your name or your company name, whichever is appropriate, the year, whatever information you want. You could set that up to add to every single image. And if you're using Lightroom, you can add it there as you're uploading your images onto your computer, where it just automatically, as it's being uploaded, is just added to the image file. So
what I always
definitely
did was
include that.
I had a template in Photo Mechanic, and the image would literally download from the camera to the computer and put it in there as it downloaded. So everything I needed to know about a situation, even if the pictures were a little bit different from one to the next, all of that stuff never got onto my computer without all of that information being in the metadata. And that was very, very helpful. So you can integrate it into your workflow really easily, so you're not sitting there 2 years later trying to figure out what this was or what happened.
Yeah.
So let's talk a little bit about modifying the contract, because I'm sure everyone's had a situation where you're with a client and they suddenly want something else or they want something different. If you have an agreement that is fairly certain and then later something is added to the request, you can certainly ask for more money. You don't have, and you also are not obligated to the change. So, just something to think about, that contracts can be modified. You can put in your contract information about whether modification is allowed, who is allowed to modify the contract, because that can be helpful too. So let's say you're photographing a group of 10 people, and one of the people is the person that hired you. You want to put in that agreement, the person who hired you is the only person allowed to make changes to what's going on and what you're going to shoot. And then if they do, here's what the charge would be, whether it's per picture or per hour, or however you want to do that. But you can anticipate, based on past behavior, what kind of modifications might be requested in the middle of a shoot, and include that in your contract and how it's handled. And then if somebody comes up to you and says, oh my gosh, we're about to do this other thing, can you stick around and shoot pictures of that? Or can you just, take me and these 2 other people on the side and take some pictures of us? And if you don't feel like that's part of what the original deal called for, you can say, well, that would be a change to what I have agreed to do. I'm happy to do it, but it has to be approved by person A. And if she says it's okay, then it's okay. But that way, if you're really in a situation where you want to limit, these sort of extra requests or these side requests, you can always make sure that that's part of your contract, that says, side requests won't be honored or must be approved and extra will be charged, or whatever the situation. So you can just accommodate these requests, because remember, if you accommodate a request, it can be accompanied by more money, and we're all in business to put food on our tables. So one thing I want you to remember about contracts, this goes back to what I was saying at the beginning. Okay, your goal is not to catch your client in a mistake, but your goal is to maintain a long-term relationship. So one of the ways you can do that is by coming up with a standard contract and offering it to them at the outset. They'll take a look at it, see if it matches what they need. Particularly with corporate clients, this is a good idea because whether a corporate client or a publishing client, they often have one thing in mind and you might have another thing in mind. So getting your terms on the table at the outset is the best way to get that conversation started and keep that relationship strong. Just for a second, I want to talk about breach of contract. So what happens if a contract or an agreement is breached? So the main thing that a breach of contract is a failure to perform the promise. That could mean somebody didn't give you the money. That's a breach of contract. Could mean you didn't show up. That's a breach of contract. You can get damages if there's a breach of contract. So that could be something called reliance damages, what you spent, expectation damages, what you would have gotten, restitution, what you lost. The simplest way is, of course, the money that a return of the money paid in one direction or the money in the other direction, but there are other things that someone loses when a contract doesn't work out. And so you have to be careful that you're not on the hook for these other things. So just like you can get damages if your client broke the agreement, they can also get damages if you broke the agreement. Maybe you had to cancel at the last minute because you were sick. Maybe your memory cards crashed. You have no pictures. Maybe your camera got stolen. Maybe your car crashed and your trunk lit on fire. Maybe they don't like the pictures, right? Of course, it's helpful to have a clause in your contract that says, they have looked at your work. They agree that your work is the kind of work that they want. And because of the subjective nature of photography, they can either have someone there approving the pictures on site, or your judgment is final on what the pictures are going to look like. But all of these are things that could happen that could lead you down a scary path if the contract is broken or allegedly broken. So reliance damages could be like what you spent, whether deposits or whether you engaged a model or an assistant, because if you hired an assistant, right, to be somewhere and then the assignment's canceled, you had an agreement with your assistant, you still owe them money. So maybe you rented gear, all of these things are things that you did in anticipation of this photo shoot working out. Maybe you weren't going to just get money from this event or thing that you're photographing, but future licensing from it. Maybe you gave up other opportunities to take this opportunity. So these are all reasons why if your client broke an agreement that you would be entitled to damages for that breach. But remember, your client might also be entitled to damages for your breach. So what did your client spend to set up this situation that you're being hired to photograph? I had a client once that I've had a couple helicopter rentals. So imagine that I think I had a client, it didn't work out, but basically I was being asked to rent a helicopter in Mexico. And it was so complicated and expensive. And I just, and it was very, very tenuous. I just didn't like the situation. But think about if, they had paid for all of that stuff and then it didn't work out, right? So, you may be on the hook for these things. A lot of people get photographed or get hired to photograph, an event where a celebrity is coming. So maybe a country club or a business has hired, somebody who they find important to be there. Well, they've also paid that person a lot of money. So if part of the purpose of that was so they could get pictures with their CEO and the famous person, and the photographer is no longer there to take those pictures, what have they lost? It could be significant. One of the things I used to love doing was watching Judge Judy, and there was always, you could count on it, a wedding client who paid $200 for a wedding and then was surprised that the pictures sucked. And so then they wanted Judge Judy to award them the value of throwing an entire new wedding so that they could get their wedding photos. She usually said no dice, but in fact, you have to think about that as a potential thing that somebody might request, and you'll have to work out if they think that you've totally screwed up the photo shoot. So like I said, you really want to have your own contract, at least a baseline contract that fits a lot of what you do, and then you can modify it as needed. I'm going to spend probably another 5 minutes going over these terms, and then I'll try to open up for questions. Because like I said, you can have an oral contract, but much better to have a written contract. So there's plenty of sample contracts online. Be very careful though, because they're not all well written. They're not all written by lawyers. And I've seen books on photography that include sample contracts that were written by non-lawyers, and you really have to be careful with that. Some terms that should be in your contract. First of all, a jurisdictional clause that tells you what jurisdiction, what law governs the contract. So we're in San Antonio, it would be this contract is governed by the laws of the state of Texas. But what's also helpful is something that says where you can enforce it. So you want them to agree to the jurisdiction of the courts of Bexar County, Texas. Let's say you have a client that comes in from California and they do something here, or even better, you fly to Nevada. They're from California. You fly to Nevada to take pictures, but you're from Texas. If there's a dispute, where is that dispute going to be resolved? Well, much easier for you if you can bring a lawsuit if it comes to that, which we hope it doesn't. But if it does, the pressure is on if you have to go somewhere else to enforce the contract. There's less pressure if you can go downtown, file your lawsuit in Bexar County, Texas, in Bexar County courts. So the jurisdictional clause is actually very, very valuable, and I see it missing from a lot of contracts, but it is one of the things that gives you power when it comes to enforcing your contract, because it's easier. You don't have to find a lawyer on the other side of the world to try to bring your lawsuit. Obviously, you're going to want copyright terms, what's included, who owns the copyright, what happens if they want to use the pictures for things later that they didn't think of now. Payment, of course, we want what's the charge, right? What are they going to pay? But also you want when is it due? The reason you want to have when the payment is due is then you know when they've breached the contract. So if the payment is due 14 days from signature and they haven't paid you by day 15, they've broken the contract. And then you can start thinking about, when you want to enforce it. Of course, you're not going to do something like that right away, but there's definitely no wiggle room on the conversation of, well, we were going to pay, but we didn't. No, you didn't pay. So you also want to talk about the liability of the client if something goes wrong. Sometimes clients take your pictures and do things they shouldn't do with them. You want to make sure that there's something in your contract that protects you in that event, that says that they're liable for their use or misuse of the pictures that you've provided them. Alongside that is, if you're doing corporate work, who is responsible for getting the model releases? I love putting clauses in photographers' contracts that basically say, if I do not hand you a model release, it doesn't exist. Because just like we were talking about earlier, you don't want to be responsible for having an archive of photographs for 100 years. You don't want to be responsible for holding onto a model release for as long as somebody might need it. You want them to know that if they're going to use pictures in a certain way, they need to make sure that they have a right to do it. And the best way to make sure they have a right to do it is that they've got the model release. They make their own determination of whether or not they can use it for the purpose they're using it for. Put it on them, because oftentimes you give someone a digital file and you don't know what they're going to do with it. You don't have power to control what they're going to do with it if the terms are very broad. So that's something you really want to protect yourself from. A limitation of liability is, let me actually forward this. We talked about these three clauses. So a limitation of liability would be, something that says the liability of the photographer is limited to the refund of the fee paid to them to that point. That's a good way, because like I said, it's very hard to determine what damages are. And so you want to limit your liability in case something goes wrong to, whatever you can limit it to. Presumably just the fee paid would be an ideal limit. Like I said, model releases don't exist unless they're provided, and you want that client to accept liability associated with the use of their images. Something that has become really increasingly important recently: cancellation clauses, force majeure. What happens if the client cancels? What happens if the photographer cancels? What happens if somebody else cancels it for you. That is really important. And it always has been, but it was sort of ignored a lot. It can be very helpful in terms of if you cancel or the photographer cancels or the client cancels, but never forget that we are not really in control. And so you want to, but the force majeure clauses typically go both ways. So, it's not designed to have you have a windfall. Like, pandemic hit, someone gave you $5,000 to shoot something and now you can't shoot it. So you just get to put that money in the bank. No, you should have a clause that's clearly spells out, maybe you've done some advanced work and need some portion of that payment. But what really ought to happen if that happens. And again, we're trying to build good relationships with clients, not catch them. So in some, a contract is an exchange of promises. Those promises can be oral or written, but of course written is much better because then we all know it's in black and white. Our memories are poor. We talked a little bit about some terms to include, and remember to do it before the shoot, not after, not as you're running out the door. So that's my website, my phone number. Jim, if you have other questions or people have other questions, I can stay until, for another 15 minutes if you want.
Desiree asked, where do you take a breach of contract? What is the process for moving that forward?
So if you can't resolve a breach of contract with your client, if it's valuable enough, you can go talk to an attorney about what your next best steps are. That's, probably a good idea. If there's a lot of money involved, if it's just over a few dollars, then, you have to think about whether it's worth it. But, an attorney like myself, I would look at the agreement between the parties. I would look at the potential loss. Sometimes it's just not worth pursuing if something's not going to work out. Mediation is something that a lot of people turn to when there's a dispute and, you're looking for a way to have somebody sort of talk to both sides. A mediator's an independent and doesn't take sides. The mediator's goal is to talk to both parties and see sort of where their positions are and, how we can resolve the dispute in a way that everyone walks away with something that makes them happy, or at least prevents it from getting to a more serious place or from litigation. So those are two things that you might want to start with a lawyer, but you also want to think about what it's worth to you. And if there's an easier way to resolve it yourself, just by talking to them. And again, having written terms about how a dispute would be handled is very, very helpful for those situations. And having written terms about whatever it is you might be in dispute on is also very helpful because then you can just say, look, it's right here. You agreed to this. And, I'm not sure why you're not holding up your end of the bargain, but let's figure out a solution to this so it doesn't have to escalate.
That's good. There were two questions related to when do you upload your photographs to the U.S. Copyright Office. So Mishu asked that question, and Desiree's is quite similar. When would you register a copyright?
Yeah, that's a great question. So different photographers do it differently. The benefit of registering is you get attorney's fees and statutory damages if there's an infringement. So the attorney's fees and statutory damages are something you get if you register before the infringement. However, there is a 3-month grace period if you register before, within 3 months after first publication of the image. Now, the definition of publication is a whole nother, I could spend an hour talking about it, but basically, like, if your work is considered published, and that's a very specific legal definition, it does not mean, that you put it in a newspaper. So you have to look at the legal definition of published, which I won't get into here. But basically, after that, you have a 3-month window or grace period to register your images, and still retain that benefit. So it's very useful for someone who's in the publication world, or then you can send your work. And this happens a lot with journalists. You'll shoot a picture, and an hour later, it's on a news website. Well, that photographer has a 3-month grace period in which to register their images in order to get the full benefit of the registration. And so it sort of does a look back, and you would still get statutory damages and attorney's fees if you had to sue someone for copyright infringement, even if they infringe your copyright within that window. And the other thing that is sometimes misconstrued about the registration, you can take all your pictures that you've registered before, or that you've taken before and not registered, and you can register them now. And then you'll get that benefit if someone infringes after the date of registration. So it's not a lost cause if you haven't registered your work previously.
Nice. Thank you for sharing that. Deyanira has a question about deposits. So taking a third deposit or a 50% deposit, what's the legal side of deposits, or taking payment in full, or making payment arrangements, all that kind of stuff?
That's something that you can negotiate with your client. Absolutely. It just depends. If you're more comfortable having everything in your pocket before you walk out the door, you can make that kind of arrangement with your client. So the question would then be, if for some reason there was a cancellation, what would happen to that deposit? And that depends again on the terms. So let's say you took 100% upfront, whether it was due the day before or whatever, and then they canceled on the day of, are you entitled to keep that whole amount? Well, it depends on what your contract says, and you want to be clear in there that this is what would happen if they canceled. And by the way, just because you have something in your contract doesn't mean you can't work with people to be fair and help them in a bad situation. And in fact, you can tell them, look, normally that would be it, and it would be forfeited, or you would owe me the full amount, but I'm willing to reschedule another week. Just because something is protects you in your contract doesn't prevent you from working with people and being generous about trying to make sure that your needs and the client's needs are both met, and that everyone walks away happy.
And it depends on what type of work you're doing, what's normal for that. It's different for event work, wedding work, portrait work, commercial work. It's all different. So whatever it is that you do, whatever you're comfortable with, whatever's normal, and then what you're comfortable with. For me, for portrait work, it's paid up front.
Yeah.
There's sometimes payment arrangements, but for the most part, it's paid up front. And I just like for weddings, and I know people who are starting out may not do this way, but I think they quickly learn, get your money up front with weddings, because afterwards they've got no money. A year before, they're good.
People have gotten divorced on the honeymoon, and maybe they don't want the pictures by the time they come back. But you still did the work, and you deserve to get paid. So 100%, every wedding photographer I've ever come across who's been in business more than a week has done that. Absolutely required it all up. And it could be 50%, 6 months before, and 100% by 2 weeks or something. But absolutely, Jim, you're 100% on that.
Rick Castillo has a couple of comments. He said that go along with what you were saying. A wise man once said, "Poor handwriting is better than a good memory."
It's very true.
He also said that his an insurance teacher said, if you can't afford insurance, you can't afford to be in business.
Yeah. And, a lot of that goes to how you structure your business. I actually helped create cost of doing business calculator for the National Press Photographers Association. If you just search NPPA cost of doing business calculator, you can see it, and it's a great way to look at, you know, how many days a year you expect to be shooting, and you plug in all your expenses, you plug in the salary you want to earn, and it'll tell you what you have to charge walking out the door in order to stay afloat. And it accounts for insurance and studio, and most importantly, paying yourself a salary. Yeah. So, you know, use tools like that to make sure that you're bringing in enough money to pay, whether it's your insurance or, you know, whether it's building into your workflow, copyright registration, whatever it is that you need to do, build it into your cost of doing business and pass it on to your client. And I'll tell you that if you don't use contracts on a regular basis, when you start doing it, the clients are going to look at you differently. Particularly corporate clients, is what they expect, and they don't see you the same way if you don't behave in a professional way. And it's sort of like dressing like a professional. You know, you dress your business like professionally and behave professionally. You act professionally when you want, and this is just part of that. This is just part of the business. So, you know, build into your business the cost of contract creation, the cost of accounting, getting a good accountant to help you, all those things. Yeah.
You bring up a lot of good things. It's amazing. It's relatively easy to start a photography business, but that does not mean that it is inexpensive. There are a lot of considerations to take into you've got to take into consideration, and you've mentioned several of them.
Yeah.
And let me see if I have another question here. Oh, Rick has. Is there a good website that's a go-to for contracts written or digital?
Well, there's a lot of websites out there with sample contracts, but none of them are going to be perfect for you because they're not necessarily designed for your business. Even if you're a portrait photographer and it's another portrait photographer, they're in a different city, so they're in a different jurisdiction. There may be different rules that they're paying attention to. So you really have to, I mean, they're very good to get you started and get you thinking, but I would highly recommend you don't just take someone else's contract and copy it and paste it and change the name, because you're going to miss stuff and make mistakes.
Yeah, that's a good choice. So if they have something like that they got from some website, some possibly not even a lawyer written, would you recommend that they have an attorney look over what they have, or start from scratch or something, but just reach out and say, you know, all right, this is what I'm doing. How am I doing here? Is there anything I need to consider or change? Do you recommend that each one of us reaches out to you or someone who specializes in this, or just go it alone?
Yeah, no. And in fact, one of the things I typically do when I work with photographers on their contracts is, you know, they have something they've already been using or something they've started with, or I'll ask them to pull together terms that they've seen elsewhere, because that helps me know where their mind is and what they're thinking of. And so, you know, then I know this is something they care about, whether it's deposit or, you know, something related to the kind of work they're doing, or the kind of customer they use. You know, sometimes there are terms that are completely natural to somebody who's in a particular line, and there's such variety in the photo world of how people work as photographers that, you know, it's impossible to know everything about every possible scenario. So it is actually very helpful for a lawyer when someone comes to you with, you know, here are the terms I think I need, and can you help me refine it and make sure that it fits? You know, of course, if you just want to start from scratch, that's always possible too. But yeah, I mean, you know, poking around and pulling a little bit here and there that strikes your fancy, it can be very helpful. But really having a professional, having an attorney go over something with you, and making sure that it says what you want it to say, does what you want it to do, leaves you in the place you want it to be left, is what I would recommend. Of course, I'm biased as
is it possible to judge? So I think one thing that a photographer may be thinking right now is, okay, I see the value in that, but what is that going to cost me to do that? So is there like a general ballpark range of what average Joe photographer going in and visiting an attorney? By the way, is it lawyer or attorney? What's appropriate?
Both.
Both. Okay. So is there a ballpark range of what they can expect for this type of review?
It usually varies. And I would sort of search around the lawyer's website, because some lawyers have flat fees, which can be very helpful. Then you know what to expect. A lot of lawyers, like what I'll usually do is, if someone can just tell me a little bit about what they're doing, then I can tell them, well, here's my hourly rate and here's what I expect. I'll even often, tell somebody, well, I can cap it at this number of hours, and even if I go over, then you have to know what to expect. Because it can be very scary to have a high hourly fee and a sort of this unlimited potential.
Mm-hmm.
But what you have to be careful about is, and this happens to me, and this is why I tend to stick to hourly, is somebody will say, well, I need a contract, just a standard contract, but they always have some sort of a side line of business that they also want covered. And then they have questions, or maybe they have an agreement with a client, and they want me to review that agreement, but there's always more questions back and forth. And so it's important to keep all of that in check, because it can get kind of out of control. But usually what I at least will do is I'll give somebody an hourly limit for their first main contract. But I always tell them, like, look, if you have another sort of side contract that you want done, that's going to be extra, and those kinds of things. So it's best to just reach out and ask what's covered. And if most lawyers, if there's a way, particularly small business lawyers that cater to small business, will find ways to give people numbers that they can expect, and that won't leave them with too much unpredictability, because we want you to get the help that you need. We don't want you to be intimidated by the potential for things to cost too much.
And lawyers are just like photographers. They care about relationships and having long-term relationships. So they're not out to there's exceptions in every group, but they're not out to get you. They're out to help you.
Right.
And just like you with you photographers with your clients, you want to do the best possible job. You care about those clients. You want to be able to have them come back to you multiple times, except for wedding photographers, I guess. That might be something you don't wish for. But but for portrait photographers, we want to be able to see our clients multiple times over our entire career. And I believe that lawyers, attorneys, generally speaking, want this same thing. They want this long-term relationship. So they're going to be helpful and care about you, and you're going to see that. And if you don't see that, well, maybe that's not the right person for you. So.
Well, thanks a lot for having me. I really appreciate the opportunity.
Yeah, this
great questions.
Has been a bunch of good questions. You guys go to calzadalegal.com. And you can get some information on our speaker today, Alicia Calzada. And thank you so much for taking your time to be here with us. I mean, there's so many. It's wonderful to know that there's so many people who are willing to give of their time to help out the photography community. And you have been doing that for years. And so, I guess I'm speaking for everybody, but we appreciate you and others that are like you. But for today, I mean, you've given your time, you've given your attention, you clearly care about what it is that you're doing. You clearly care about us, or you wouldn't have spent the time with us. And so thank you so much for being here. There's been several thank yous, and I'm putting some of them on the screen right now. Let's see, Rick and Ivan, and this is Chuck. It says Charlie Ray, but I know him. It's Chuck. Nita,
I really respect and admire so much what all of you do, and it's obviously very close to my heart. So it's a privilege to me. Thanks.
Mishu, Dave, Yeah, man, thank you so much. You will be speaking for Photo SA on September 9th, and that's an evening meeting, and it'll be a different topic.
Yeah, it's going to be a fun topic. So we're going to talk about your rights to take pictures in parks. You remember I touched on a minute ago, somebody asked a question about taking pictures in public, and parks are a part of that. And so we were involved, my work with the National Press Photographers Association got us involved in a really interesting case, which I wrote an amicus brief on, related to permitting and the rights to take pictures in national parks. And so I've got a lot of great info related to that. It was a great case to be a part of, and I'll talk about that.
That's pretty fascinating that you were on that case, and so you are on that. It's still ongoing, right?
Well, I helped write an amicus brief on that case.
Oh, okay.
I wasn't the lawyer who brought the lawsuit. He's an ally of ours who works in the First Amendment space. And came to us and said, well, this case was, came to us, and will you and PPA draft an amicus brief on it? And we, of course, would love to. The photographer, well, it was a filmmaker, he won, and the permitting scheme for the national parks that involved filmmaking and commercial filmmaking was thrown out by a federal judge. The federal government is appealing. So when I say that we're still working on it, it's because
that's why
there's an appeal now. It doesn't cost the government any extra to file an appeal, so they often do.
So of course they're going to do it. Okay.
But it was a very powerful opinion at the trial court level, and the judge did a phenomenal job, and I really enjoyed telling them.
Oh, wow. So she'll be back with us. That's September 9th, 6:30. That's Photo SA, the Camera Club Photo SA. And you see on your screen the address to go there if you want to RSVP for that, to let us know that you're coming. Yeah. Let's see. So thank you once again for spending your time with us here on the Portrait Prophet Show, Alicia. You are awesome. We really appreciate your knowledge, your caring. So thank you so much for being here today. And you guys, again, go to her website. I'll leave that up for just a little bit. She's not going to stay for questions afterwards, but you can reach out to her and send her questions direct. So go to calzadalegal.com.
Thanks so much.
Thank you. Bye-bye. Oh, man. Wasn't she amazing? So definitely check that out. Go to calzadalegal.com. I have a couple of things I want to share with you. I just mentioned that the September 9th Photo Essay meeting is with Alicia. She's talking about photographing in national parks. The one coming up on the first Thursday of August is local PPA president, Dane Miller. And he's going to be talking about, and I have to read it, how to, let me pull that over here. How to carve out a career in photography is his topic, and that's the first Thursday in August. So I want to tell you guys that the sponsors for this show are Digital Pro Lab and Landers Photography School. You probably know that already, but Digital Pro Lab, Amanda has given us a promo code. And she mentioned, if you were here at the beginning of the show, she mentioned at the end of the show, we would be sharing that with you. And so this is 25% off press cards from Digital Pro Lab. This is great for thank you cards. I definitely recommend to my students that you create custom thank you cards and you send them out often. Every time there's an excuse to write a thank you card, write a thank you card. Send it to them in the mail. How often do you receive stuff like that? Yeah, crickets. We just don't see it very often. That's one way to help you stand out from the crowd. Something that we all have trouble with, something we're all concerned with, is standing out from every other photographer. Doing something that used to be done commonplace is now something that causes you to stand out. And so this could be save the date cards, invitations, holiday cards, custom marketing pieces. This promo code, the 25% off using the promo code IMPRESSIVE, all lowercase, IMPRESSIVE, ends on August 1st. at midnight. So go to digitalprolab.com and take advantage of that. That's 25% off, guys. That's a great deal. I've seen 10% off before. I haven't seen 25% off before. Take advantage of it. Get those thank you cards made. Even have your Christmas cards made early. Do it. Take advantage of that. I want to thank each and every one of you for being here today. For Landers Photography School and Digital Pro Lab, this is Jim Landers bringing you the weekly Portrait Profit Show, giving you evolving content, awareness, and even fun to the business side of photography. We provide helpful information, step-by-step processes, how-to articles, and action steps that will help you with the struggles you deal with now, so you are constantly realigned to the path that leads to the success you deserve. Thank you guys for being here at the Portrait Profit Show. I look forward to seeing you next Monday. Bye-bye for now.